Last year, the government published its 25-year plan to improve the environment, and this talked a lot about environmental net gain. The government's stated ambition was to be the first government to leave the environment in a better state than they found it. And this was not seen as incompatible with improving infrastructure and addressing the shortage of housing and economic growth. And the way the government pledged to support development and the environment was embedding the principle of net gain within the planning system, as this quote from Michael Gove illustrates. Now, the first big step in this direction was the publication of the National Planning Policy Framework that we've already heard about a few times this morning. Now, paragraph 170 of the NPPF states that planning policies and decisions should contribute to and enhance the natural and local environment by minimising impacts and providing net gains in biodiversity. The revised NPPF also talks about net gain being measurable, meaning that biodiversity losses and gains need to be quantified and presented with a planning application to inform decision making. So even before the Environment Bill, biodiversity net gain is here and it's enshrined in the NPPF, and it needs to be measurable. In response to this, we're already seeing local planning authorities stipulating biodiversity net gain as part of their planning requirements and net gain appearing on local plan review documents. So we've come a long way in 18 months. Now, in terms of what prompted government to move in this direction, the first and obvious thing is that wildlife in the country is disappearing at an alarming rate, and the government wanted to act. This last month, there's been national press coverage following the publication of the UK's State of Nature report, compiled by 70 wildlife organisations and described as the most comprehensive analysis of the state of the UK's wildlife to date. And despite some notable conservation success stories, the overall trend looks bleak. A quarter of UK mammals and nearly half of birds assessed as being at risk of extinction. And populations of our most important wildlife, priority species, down by an average of 60% since 1970. Populations of once familiar and common species like hedgehog and water vole, down by 2/3 in just 20 years. At the same time, the benefits of wildlife-rich green space to human happiness and health are being increasingly documented. These are some recent ONS figures on the monetary value of the UK's natural capital, and specifically our urban, green and blue spaces. A recent study has also shown that people living in neighbourhoods where they can see a greater diversity of birds, shrubs and trees are less likely to suffer from depression, anxiety and stress, even controlling for the positive effects of outdoor activity. The conclusion was that nature in general made cities healthier and happier places to live. Given that green space and access to nature provides a proverbial natural high, it's not surprising then that being near to green spaces increases property prices. This again is recent ONS data showing that property prices are on average £2,500 higher where properties are close to green space. Having a view of green or blue space was found to increase property prices even more. So that's the background. So what does biodiversity net gain actually mean? Well, to try and explain the concept, Natural England have used some Lego. And conceptually, it's kind of nice and simple. If habitat is removed and it's not replaced, that's net loss. If it's replaced, having been removed, then that's no net loss. If it's replaced and then some additional habitat is created, that's net gain, which is lovely and straightforward. But the difficult bit is quantifying the green stuff in the picture. If you were building a new hotel on a car park, you might think that you'd need fewer Lego trees than if you were building that same hotel on an area of species-rich grassland, for example. But how do you quantify this? And how can you do it objectively and present it with a planning application? Well, the answer is that Defra have launched a new metric, the Defra Metric 2.0. This is a spreadsheet-based system which converts biodiversity into a single unit of measurement, a biodiversity unit. So in essence, what the government actually means by biodiversity that provides net gain is biodiversity that provides a net gain in biodiversity units as calculated by their metric. So I've said that biodiversity is a complicated concept, so how are biodiversity units in the metric calculated? Well, to simplify nature's complexity, Defra have used habitat type as a single proxy for biodiversity. So individual species of plant and animal aren't considered. The metric also doesn't consider indirect effects, only the habitat that's directly lost, gained or modified by a proposal. And the units associated with the habitat type are a function of how large it is, its distinctiveness, which reflects its value to wildlife, and its condition. And this is the same for any habitats that are being created or enhanced, although there are modifications depending on how difficult it is to create that habitat and how long it's going to take to reach the target condition. So essentially, quantifying the effect of development using biodiversity unit becomes a theoretical exercise where you compare the number of units on a site before the proposal with the predicted number after the proposal. And the unit values for the different habitat types and the multipliers are all preset in the metric. So the government intend this to be a transparent, objective system which is standardised, essentially a level playing field. So to meet net gain obligations, the required number of biodiversity units need to be provided on the development site, which is what I'll be talking about today, or locally through a legal agreement with a local landowner, or via payment of a cash tariff towards a strategic delivery scheme, or a combination. The mitigation hierarchy still applies, so first seeking to avoid impacts, then minimise them, then using on-site compensation measures, and then finally, if there's no alternative, looking at offsetting off-site. The government's estimate is that the tariff costs might be set between £9,000 and £15,000 per unit, which reflect the cost of creating and managing compensatory habitat for 30 years. So that's the theory. How would it work in practice? This is a 15-hectare fictional development site made up of agricultural fields. So to determine how many biodiversity units were associated with this, we'd carry out a phase 1 habitat survey that many of you may be familiar with, and we'd collect some data on habitat condition. This could all be done in a single visit. The site comprises agricultural fields used for cereal production and different types of improved and semi-improved grasslands. We'd then calculate the area of each habitat and the length of habitats for linear habitats like hedgerows. This information then goes into the metric. So we have our habitat type, we have our habitat areas, the distinctiveness, the value to wildlife is preset. We then put in our habitat condition, a score on connectivity, and hey presto, we get our number of biodiversity units, which in this case is 47.4. It's the same process for hedgerows, only it's length rather than area, and on this site we've got 19.2 units. Now, LHC Design have very kindly prepared an outline style residential development layout for this site using kind of standard densities, and it's a layout with good ecological credentials. The hedgerows have been retained except for where they're crossed by road or pedestrian accesses. We've got single lane crossings of internal hedgerows. We've also got the development parcels not directly abutting hedgerows, so there's opportunities for hedgerows to be buffered and retained within public realm with access for future maintenance. We've also got SUDs in the form of attenuation basins, and there's potential for a really good quality green infrastructure network. So how do you think this might fare in net gain terms? Well, apart from the hedgerows, essentially we're removing all of the habitats within the site. So the key thing is going to be the approach to the landscape design. Basically, the habitats units that are generated will depend entirely on the unit scores of the different landscape treatments that are chosen. So the next stage would be for us to enter our post-development landscape treatments into the same spreadsheet on a different page, with the habitats again scored according to their distinctiveness, condition, with the multipliers applied depending on how difficult it is to create those habitats and how long it will take for them to mature. So following that approach, we've looked at the unit calculation based on what I've described as formal landscaping. So we've got landscaping which is dominated by amenity grassland that's regularly mown and exotic shrubs, ornamental shrubs. Our baseline was 47.4 units and 19.2 hedgerow units. Because the hedgerows are largely retained, post-development there'd be 18.48 hedgerow units, and the new landscaping would generate 16.53 units, which would mean a total net change of minus 30.87. Now, in financial terms, to achieve net gain using the midpoint of the government's figures on the cost of biodiversity units, that would equate to an offset payment of about £460,000 to deliver the required 38.34 units. Now, if we had a more ecological emphasis to the landscaping, could we generate the required number of units without reducing the extent of developable area? So we've gone through the same exercise again, but this time we've replaced the suds ponds with suds ponds that contain standing water and marshy grassland, which scores better using the metric. We've replaced some of the amenity grassland with wildflower meadow and wildflower margins. We've replaced some of the ornamental planting with native structure planting, so hazel and willow thickets, that type of thing. We've also included 300 metres of new native hedgerow. Also a commitment to improve the condition of retained hedgerows so that their condition goes from moderate to high condition, which again would score points using the metric. And running the metric again, the unit scores are much more favourable. There's now a net gain in hedgerow units, but there is still a net loss as far as habitat units are concerned, although the amount of net loss has been reduced by 50%. So essentially, that would save you half the value of the offset, so £230,000. So even on this site, which comprised low-grade habitats, and there are no priority habitats or high-value habitats on this site, it's very difficult to achieve net gain. Even if we'd used all of the non-developed land for habitat creation, we'd have been struggling to get to net gain. The only way that I could see we could have done this on this site is if we retained the northern field, which scored the highest as far as biodiversity units were concerned, and then a commitment was made to bring that into better management to raise it from moderate to high condition. If that had happened, we would have reduced the unit loss and would have increased the unit gain and would have been up towards net gain. And that really illustrates, I think, the key implication of biodiversity net gain as proposed by the government. Essentially, there's a financial incentive for all of our clients to seek design solutions that minimise the loss and maximise the gains in biodiversity units as measured by the Defra metric. So essentially, this means retaining key wildlife habitats and incorporating new ones. And there are a range of medium distinctiveness habitats that integrate very well with multifunctional green space and suds. And these can provide interest and attractive features within an urban environment. So these include familiar habitats like wildflower meadows, wildflower grassland margins, native hedgerows, wet grassland, broadleaf woodland, community orchards, native shrub planting, and so on. And this slide is from a recent Natural England presentation, which was explained to industry what net gain was all about. And you can see these type of habitats illustrated. You can see suds ponds that have been designed with ecological input, and you can see wildflower margins. You can see some hedgerow planting along there, and so on. Even with these sort of features, it's very difficult to achieve net gain. We've been employed by some of our clients to retrospectively apply the metric to developments that have already been built or consented to see how it would look in net gain terms. And we're finding, unless there are very large areas of public open space or suitable alternative natural green space provided for other reasons, it's going to be difficult to achieve. But this is one residential development that I've worked on that is forecast to achieve biodiversity net gain. And this is Saxon Brook near Exeter, which is a red row homes development of 350 homes on a 18-hectare site. And you can see some of the houses in the bottom left of the picture. Now, pre-development, the site primarily comprised of agriculturally improved grassland, which scored 36 biodiversity units. The public open space on the site was designed to include wildflower meadow, native shrubs, orchard, and the centrepiece was this wildlife pond. And post-development, the site scored 42 biodiversity units. And as well as the meadow, there's also, as you can see, there's circular routes for the new community to enjoy the green space and the habitats that have been created. And for this development, Redrow joined up with the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, who advised on seed mixes and plant species that would be the best nectar sources. And as you can see from this quote from Nicola Hansen, the sustainability manager at Redrow Homes, it's not something that they see as a one-off. It's something that they want to see forming part of a wider group strategy. Nature for People forms one of Redrow's 8 design principles in its placemaking strategy, and they've got a Nature for People strategy with biodiversity net gain at its heart. And they've drawn up new specifications for ecology consultants like myself and landscape consultants, and also management companies to try and facilitate this. Before we move away from net gain, one thing to be aware of is that the metric sits alongside and doesn't replace the legal and policy protection given to protected sites and protected species, like the dormouse shown here. So the familiar constraints associated with protected species, breakers, reeds, bats and so on, they still apply. But the habitat mitigation and compensation measures required for such species, such as ensuring no net loss of habitat for, say, dormice, would obviously generate biodiversity units using the metric. So again, it can actually become a multifunctional aspect of green spaces. Dormice are very common in the southwest, so that example site I gave you, and there needed to be intro retention on a site like that in any case if you had species like dormice present. Okay, well, moving from the national to the local, this is Cornwall Council's recent Planning for Biodiversity Guide. And there's lots of very good stuff on ecology design in here, including Cornwall Council's expectations for planning applications, which is mirroring the requirements that are evolving elsewhere. And Cornwall Council is expecting each new residential unit to provide at least one bat or bird box or brick per unit. And they're also looking at least one bee brick within every other unit. So one bee brick for every 2 units. And this is something that I'm seeing more and more often in other local authority areas, that there's an expectation for this rather than this is considered to be something that's an addition. But things like bird and bat boxes don't actually score in the metric. It's all about habitat types. There's also a requirement for close board fencing to have hedgehog highways or holes that species can get through to increase permeability of residential developments. Also, to go back to the Defra metric, the council are looking at use of the metric to determine whether planning applications are delivering net gain. Now, talking about bird boxes, one bird that nests in buildings is the swift. It's a familiar sight over towns in the summer. Characteristic silhouette of its horseshoe-shaped wings, its screaming calls that are well known. But it's a rapidly declining species. There's been a 50% decrease in breeding numbers of swifts since 1995. And one of the reasons for this is the lack of nesting sites and the loss of nesting sites. There's obviously an increasing desire for energy efficient buildings and impermeable homes, and modern buildings generally provide few nest sites, older buildings demolished or refurbished. So it means that swifts don't often have places to nest. One easy solution to this, obviously, is the integral swift boxes or external boxes. And there's off-the-peg solutions for most situations. And there's a lot of research in terms of where are the best places to place these. The Action for Swift website is a good source of information. These are the Manthorpe Swift bricks. And as well as swifts, other declining species like house sparrows will also use them. So it's an easy thing to include on different types of developments, commercial or residential. I've talked about hedgerows already. On typical greenfield sites that we work on, much of a site's ecological interest is all associated with the hedgerows rather than the intensively managed agricultural fields. And retained hedgerows with an urban development form attractive, ready-made features. Now, as well as retaining hedgerows, the interface between the hedgerows and the urban development is also important. And with this in mind, Cornwall Council provided sustainability ratings for different hedgerow treatments. And again, this is something that we're seeing mirrored in other local authority design guidance. So, this, as you'd expect, scores the best sustainability rating, and this is when hedgerows are retained in public realm with buffers on either side. So hedgerows that have perhaps a road on one side with a verge and perhaps public open space on the other. This means that the hedgerow can be managed in the long term to retain its function and form as a hedgerow, and it's less likely to be affected by homeowners or replanted or removed. And this is a hedgerow that scored the lowest in terms of sustainability rating. This is when you have a hedgerow squeezed between back gardens with close-board fencing up against it, which means there's a high chance that homeowners may remove it or change the management of it and so on. So what Cornwall Council is saying is if hedgerows are retained in developments in this form, they'll treat it as 50% hedgerow loss, which obviously has implications for the mitigation and compensation you need to provide, particularly if the Defra metric is used as a way of quantifying your impacts. So, to summarise then, biodiversity net gain is to become a significant consideration for development design. There's now a financial incentive for design that minimises the loss and maximises the gains of biodiversity units as measured by the metric. And to successfully manage this new requirement is going to require close collaboration between ecologists, urban designers, architects and master planners right from the start. And it'll be interesting to see whether this just turns into something that essentially is a new tax on development, or whether it's something that really provides the impetus to make developments more interesting and really does incorporate biodiversity into development. And I'm hopeful of the latter. Thank you.